Good evening and welcome back. I hope you had a great dinner. My name is Natalie Dixon. I'll be moderating this next session. And I'm very happy to introduce David Joselit. He's all the way from New York. And for those of you who don't know him, he's a critic, educator, former curator, as well as an art historian. And he's currently based at the Graduate Center at CUNY, or the City University of New York. Previously, he's been at the Art History Department at Yale University. And amongst his many books and essays, I'd like to mention After Art, which Barbara mentioned to me is one of the seminal works that influenced the production of this festival, so on a good note. And then Painting Beside Itself, Feedback, Television Against Democracy, and his latest book, which is forthcoming, Heritage and Debt, Art and Globalization. In just looking at a few YouTube videos and researching and reading through your books, I've gathered a very small sample of what I think is the opinion of the art world. And I think it's one of David being a well-respected, measured, mindful, rather critical, and respected voice in the field. So we're very happy to have him here tonight. Please put your hands together for David Joselit.
Thank you, Natalie, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to Barbara and Bas for inviting me. It's great to be here in this context between media, politics, and art. So I'm going to talk about authenticity and terror. Here are two images which demonstrate two opposing attitudes toward cultural heritage. The bombing of Palmyra in Syria on the left, and François Hollande at the Louvre in front of ancient Assyrian reliefs. The photograph on the left shows the bombing of the ancient Baal Shamin temple in Palmyra in Syria, as represented by images that were widely circulated by ISIS in August of 2015. This is a site whose construction spans the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 2nd century after the Common Era. The temple is dedicated to a Semitic god, a lord of the heavens, whose image, from a fundamentalist point of view, should be destroyed in order to purify an authentic religious genealogy. On the right, as I mentioned, is the French president at the Louvre in front of ancient Assyrian reliefs, pledging his support to, in his words, rescue endangered objects from the current conflicts in the Middle East. Here, as opposed to the fundamentalist perspective, is an Enlightenment notion of collecting together all world cultures in the Universal Museum as represented by the Louvre. In a speech given at the Metropolitan Museum on September 20th, 2016, in conjunction with the United Nations Summit for Refugees and Migrants, Hollande announced a $100 million fund to protect cultural heritage that was endangered by the conflicts. As reported by the Art newspaper, in addition to preservation, intervention, and even plans for post-conflict restoration of important sites, Hollande pledged, quote, asylum for some endangered works of art. This is a curious term, given the resistance toward accepting Syrian refugees in Europe and the Gulf states. What does it mean to offer asylum, in those words, to art objects, but resist giving it to human refugees? That's, in a way, one of the stakes of my lecture tonight. In her 2008 article, The Humanity Game, Art, Islam, and the War on Terror, the cultural anthropologist Jessica Weiner helps us to explain this displacement from refuge persons to refuge objects. Weiner argues that after the attacks of 9/11 in New York, there was a rise in art programming of Middle Eastern art in the West in order to create what she calls a bridge of understanding. There are two objectives in such bridging of the Middle East and the West as represented by Europe and the United States in this formulation. First, the use of art, and often, as in the case of Assyrian reliefs, ancient art, which is important pre-Islamic art, but from the Middle Eastern region, as Hollande is standing in front of an Assyrian relief, to use such ancient art as a universal sign of humanity. As Weiner, the anthropologist I'm following in this argument, writes, the bridge of understanding narrative rests on the idea that art is prime evidence of a suitable bearer of Middle Easterners' humanity, but it is a very particular definition of humanity that is advanced under the guise of universal humanism. It is one that allows Middle Eastern Muslims to be human only in the past or only if they eschew political Islam or critique religion, unquote. Her second point is that contemporary art, such as the work of the very well-known Iranian-American artist Shirin Neshat, and here I'm showing you her work Speechless from 1996, the work of women is seized upon because it can carry a message of secular feminism, which is distinctly opposed or is explicitly and polemically opposed to the religious oppression and fanatical attributes attached to radical forms of Islam. This work by Neshat, who was born in Iran, as I mentioned, but educated and lives in the United States, is part of a series called Women of Allah. It is a photograph covered with a very small text. Some of you may know that, but it's a little bit hard to see from a distance. But all of that, what looks like pixelization or something like that, is in fact writing. And it is a text by an Iranian poet in which a woman asks her male brothers of the revolution, as he puts it, if she can participate in the fighting. So it has a very polemical kind of counter message of participation of women in a kind of armed struggle, which is a kind of ironic pointing out of the fact that women are placed in a certain kind of subordinate position, at least from the point of view of the West, within those worlds. Like much of Neshat's work, this piece is often interpreted as a feminist artist's resistance to women's disempowerment under certain practices of Islam. It therefore becomes a symbolic cultural weapon against Islamic fundamentalism. So the two kind of bridge of understanding methods that I'm pointing out here, helped by Jessica Weiner, are cosmopolitan feminism on the one hand and museumification on the other. They are opposed to fundamentalist positions. They offer refuge to Middle Eastern artifacts through their entrance into the museum and their introduction into secular humanist culture, including feminism. But the strategy of polemicizing heritage is obviously not unique to the West. In another turn of the screw, on the same day as Hollande's speech at the Metropolitan Museum, it was reported that Manuel Rabate, who's pictured below here with a little headline from one of the art distribution websites, it was reported that he was appointed director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, whose spectacular building is designed by the French architect Jean Nouvel in a rather orientalizing fashion, as you can see in this rendering. The Louvre will be an institution whose purpose is to burnish the image of the Gulf states as capitals of business, culture, and tourism, an image in direct opposition to the fundamentalism of ISIS, rooted in other parts of the Middle East, and which depends on, and this version of cosmopolitan depends on the prestige that inheres in a general secular form of humanity, as epitomized by the Encyclopedic Humanist Enlightenment Museum. So the point here then is that these positions toward heritage need not be territorially limited to the US and Europe, but also are taken up by other parts of the world in a gesture of resistance to fundamentalist strategies toward heritage and politically more broadly. The Gulf states are making a huge gambit for cultural prestige that goes well beyond this one project, as you may know. In fact, I'll just as a sideline, in Doha and Qatar, it's very interesting that there are contemporary museums an Islamic museum, and a museum of Orientalism that have all been built up together in Doha, the capital. So it's easy from such a perspective to see how art objects literally can stand in for humans or refugees. And again, this is the kind of point I want to make here, that the bridge is being made with things as opposed to humans. They're a little easier to manage, as we know. When, for instance, President Joe Biden, who's standing here at the Metropolitan Museum in New York with the director, Thomas Campbell, of the Met, at the same UNESCO conference where Hollande made his announcement of a $100 million fund, he made a speech at the Met and said the following: "The drive to build, the drive to sanctify tradition is what makes us human. And this is why defending cultural heritage is defending all humanity," unquote. So heritage here equals humanity, and protecting objects is equivalent to protecting people. But let's consider the role of heritage from the point of view of Hollande and Biden's opponents. Here is a still from a video released by the Islamic State showing the destruction of archaeological artifacts in Mosul's museum in northern Iraq in February 2015. And this is a still, as I mentioned. I should say that there's also controversy around the veracity of the pictures I'm showing you, but I'm not getting into this because for my argument, it's somewhat irrelevant. This action, which was well and skillfully publicized, must be understood not only as a terrible crime, even some have suggested a crime against humanity, but also a strike against the universalist model of humanity that the Enlightenment Museum represents, as I've been trying to argue. Indeed, the historian of Islamic art, Barry Finbar Flood, has argued precisely this with regard to the Taliban's famous destruction of cultural properties, including the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. And here I'm showing you a slide of, let's say, before and after of that destruction. Flood writes, quote, "Given the ways in which the aesthetic, economic, and institutional aspects of modernity are articulated around the transmutation of the cult image into the cultural icon," so here he's arguing that one definition of modernity is from cult, from religious object, to secular museum object. He goes on to argue, "It is hardly surprising that in the modern nation state, the museum, rather than the church, is the primary target of traditional iconoclastic behavior." So precisely that museum, which is the seat of humanity in terms of Hollande and Biden, from a different point of view, could be understood as a kind of assertion of Western values, even a kind of terror, pushing it perhaps too far. Secondly, the ostensibly traditional iconoclasm of Islamic fundamentalism is in fact anything but traditional in its use of mass media to publicize its acts over the internet, as we've seen, and also its organized effort to sell looted works to fund its activities. So there's been a lot in the news recently, not only about the destruction of cultural heritage, but the perhaps paradoxical harvesting of artifacts for sale in the West by the combatants of ISIS in the Middle East. And in fact, my point here is that both the publicity around these acts through savvy use of the internet, and also the production of profits through the sale of artworks, are extremely savvy in terms of their technical capacities. They're modern, in other words. As Michael Dante, academic director of the American Schools of Orient Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives, has written, quote, "While ISIL," using the alternate acronym for ISIS, the Islamic State, I'm referring to in both cases, while ISIL, or the Islamic State, destroys some ancient sculptures for the cameras, the vast majority of artifacts and other cultural property is sold or cached for later marketing, unquote. And this marketing is in fact very effectively directed from Syria and Iraq through the internet, offering, as this is sort of the one place where I kind of key into the digital side of this conference. I'm afraid I'm more in the authenticity side, I should say, but there is a very strong media dimension here because the modernity of jihad and later the Islamic State is in fact extremely digital. So Dante puts it this way, the archaeologist who's done this broad survey, quote, supply-end criminals have unprecedented access to global markets and new methods for avoiding some of the risks in the trafficking and sale of illicit cultural property. So the internet has actually been used very effectively as a tool, both in terms of propaganda and in terms of sales. Ironically, doing exactly what we do so well in the West, which is to commodify works of art. So ISIS, or the Islamic State, is in fact countering the Western celebrations and museumification of universal humanity by first literally destroying the sanctity of the Universal Museum. And I think it's important to at least entertain the possibility, as Barry Flood does, the Islamicist I quoted earlier, that the attacks on the museum are not exclusively attacks on individual works, but attacks on the museum as an institution as well, as Flood argues. So there is first the destruction of the museum, an attack against the museum and the contents of the museum, but also by looting and selling artworks, they are objectifying works of art as commodities, as opposed, quite interestingly, to how Hollande and Biden humanize works of art by treating them as surrogates for refugees. The Indian artist Subodh Gupta's work, Renunciation, embodies these contradictory claims between the values of the museum, principled iconoclasm, and the exploitation of the world market for artworks and artifacts. And here is Gupta's work, Renunciation, from 2012, where he makes a miniature, but still quite large. You can sort of see by the scale of the doorway in the gallery that it's photographed here, version of the destroyed Bamiyan Buddha. So it's a kind of paradoxical work that is the production of an absence. On the one hand, the act of iconoclasm itself becomes a museum object, which is a direct contradiction, right? The absent is made present, but more interestingly, absence and presence are in a highly unstable relation to one another, unresolved relation. And secondly, the sacred site is made portable, even though it would be hard to carry this in your suitcase, but it's a lot smaller than the site-specific Bamiyan site. So he is instantiating the kind of effect of site specificity to mobility that I was pointing to in the looting done by the Islamic State. I'm just going to pour a little water. I want to argue that this dynamic in which Western modernity incorporates all of the world's traditions into the Universal Museum, while Islamic fundamentalism, as modernity, incorporates communication and commerce into its own alleged return to uncompromising tradition, is part of a much larger dynamic between modernity and tradition that continues to inform global contemporary art. I think that this play between modernity and tradition is at the heart of Western modernism, even though modernism is usually understood as a kind of rupture from one style to another. Such canonical accounts are premised on progress and evolution. If visualized diagrammatically, they would describe an ascending vector in which artistic movements supersede their predecessors through successive negations. So here, I'm not going to go into detail, obviously, but this is familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, this idea that art proceeds, let's say modern art proceeds as a greater and greater practice of non-objective abstraction. So we have Monet's Haystacks from 1891, Picasso's Reservoir from 1919, an analytic cubist work which breaks down structures even more. And then there is, right here in the Netherlands, Mondrian's non-objective system as of 1920. So this is how we think of art as moving, and despite all of the work that's been done to dismantle the canon, there's still a very strong impulse toward this. In fact, the romance with surpassing or negating previous stages of modern art's development, which might seem old-fashioned in this example, is just as clear in how we think about conceptual art's dematerialization of objects by transforming them into information. So what conceptual art does is also create a tabula rasa, but not through creating abstract form, rather by transposing things into information. Here's another touch point with the themes of our conference. One that won't be pursued in this lecture so much, but that we might think about. And yet modernism in the West, including its late or postmodernist variations, following from conceptual art, arose from an encounter between emergent conditions of socioeconomic modernity, confronted, such as industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of commodity culture, with increasingly endangered forms of heritage, national identity. Here is just a classic example of Monet's railway bridge at Argenteuil, where the train is running through the landscape as a kind of introduction of a disruptive modernization within, let's say, a timeless landscape, a simplification, but one that I hope you'll let me hold as a placeholder for a more complex set of dynamics around the modern and the traditional at the very constitution of modern art. As Andreas Huyssen has put it, quote, European modernism arrived at the threshold of a not yet modernized world in which old and new were violently knocked against each other, striking the sparks of that astounding eruption of creativity that came to be known only later as modernism. So here I want us to think about modernism as, in fact, constitutively a encounter between something defined as modernity and something defined as tradition. Usually, in canonical descriptions of this, primitivism being one of them, as demonstrated by Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon from 1907, the idea of an intervention of heritage, whether the African mask on the right or allusions to ancient Basque sculpture by Picasso in the figure on the left and elsewhere, are usually subsumed within formal innovation. So the idea of what I'm calling in my book heritage is subsumed in innovation. What I want to argue is that in fact that was always a myth, and that the two are in constant tension all through practices of modern, and it has precisely to do with how we delineate that which is modern. This ideological elision of or subsumption of heritage or tradition into formal innovation that often this painting is used to demonstrate not only distorts the history of Western modernism and narrows its canon, but it makes it especially difficult to recognize non-Western experiences of modernity that follow different timelines and privilege different modern genres or forms, such as realism, which in places outside of the West can be extremely modern in ways that formally we would not recognize as such. As the Indian writer Tabish Khair's put it, quote, the opposition is not really between tradition and Europe, it is between tradition and modernity, in the sense that modernity was removed from the cultural and historical space of countries like India in the course of colonization. Europe, now this is very important what he says, Europe could move easily by itself from tradition to modernity within its own intellectual heritage. But India, Egypt, China, and other traditions could only be modernized through European circumstances. This introduced a synchronic and diachronic rift between tradition and modernity that post-colonial countries have yet to bridge. So why I think this is important is that the same dynamic between tradition and modernity is happening both in the West and outside the West, but it's the transformation to modernity is understood ideologically to be internal to Western traditions and external to non-Western ones. And here, a blank I didn't use, here is just, I can't go into this obviously because of time, but I want to just make an assertion to make this point about modernities that are outside of Western heritage, but are, well, not exclusively in the case of socialist realism, really, but that's a longer argument. But anyway, that aren't recognized as such, but that we must learn to recognize as modernities. And here are almost exactly contemporaneous work by Jackson Pollock and one by Dong Xiwen, The Founding Ceremony of the Nation, a socialist realist work from a year after Pollock's. What I would argue is that both of these are modern, and that it's highly consequential to pretend, I'll say, that the one on the left is modern and the one on the right is not. I'm just going to throw that out because in this talk I'm following a different string, but analogous within the case of the kind of clash of civilizations debate that I've introduced. So recognizing the plasticity of tradition and modernity as categories, in other words, their precarity, their provisionality, their ideological nature, is crucial to grasping the structure of globalization, which has been powerfully framed politically and culturally in terms of civilizational conflict. Again, you know, we thought that we were done with the clash of civilizations. That book cover will make a cameo appearance at the end of my lecture. But in fact, as this instance from just this year suggests, the clash of civilizations is still a very strong dynamic between, for instance, a secular modern West and Islamic fundamentalisms emerging from the global South, which are habitually dismissed as regressive in their profound embrace of tradition, which, as we've seen, is in fact factually untrue. In fact, as we've seen, such an emphasis on strict geohistorical divisions and the resulting emphasis worldwide on policing national borders, especially after attacks of 9/11, does not hold water. Not only are Islamic militants who are affiliated with the Islamic State and other groups more frequently citizens of Europe or the United States than they are refugees, but fundamentalist radicalism takes full advantage of modern technologies, as we've seen. In other words, forms of jihad and assertion of statehood emerging in the late 20th century and the early 21st are unambiguously global and modern. Conversely, as we know and has been discussed powerfully and emotionally in this conference already, radical nativism has become as prevalent in the West as it is in the global South. As evidenced in the 90s by the Balkan Wars, there are many, many different examples: Christian fundamentalism, Brexit, and my own country's spawning of Donald Trump. Another way of saying this is that from a Western secular point of view, fundamentalism is understood as terror, whereas on its own terms, it's actually a search for authenticity, an authentic modernity. And the Universalist Museum is itself a kind of terror, which is made clear by the worldwide efforts to repatriate objects that were, as claimed by the complainants, illegally taken from places like Peru, places like Greece, places all over the world by Western museums. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not making an apology for terrorism or for the Islamic State, nor, for that matter, for the Universal Museum. Rather, what I want to put pressure on here is how these dividing lines between tradition and modernity, or authenticity and terror, are drawn in ways that have enormous political ramifications. I want to argue as well, I'll talk about that ramifications as I conclude, but I want to think about how this condition has been addressed and can be addressed by artists, because I think that some of the most significant art being made today is focused precisely on such definitional, or what I like to call informational plasticity. In fact, this kind of redrawing of conceptual categories might be the most political thing that art can accomplish right now. I want to talk just briefly about this will probably be no surprise given my themes, the work of Walid Rad, a Lebanese artist who's based in New York and in Beirut, and particularly to draw out a few theoretical points from his Atlas Group project from 1989 to 2004. Here I'm showing you the online homepage of the Atlas Group. This work is devoted to destabilizing the line between the archive and the artwork, fiction and document. The Atlas Group is a fictional archive about the Lebanese wars that was created entirely by a single author, Walid Rad. And what's important is he has never made any effort to simulate this as a true archive. He's always allowed both realities to coexist. And this is kind of what I think art can do. It's not fundamentalism versus the universal humanist secularism, but it's both in some kind of negotiation. He's proposed to write history as an artist, which entails two very interesting moves. First is to make history, to recognize history as an abstraction. As he puts it, the Atlas Group proceeds with the consideration that the Lebanese wars are an abstraction. One troubling question is, under what notion of facts can we operate in our construction of the history of Lebanon? How do we approach the fact of war, unquote. Now, you could say that this is trivializing, but in fact, all wars are abstractions. And this is enormously consequential because they're prosecuted through those abstractions. So his first, let's say, aesthetic claim is that war, the representation of it, is an abstraction. The second is that he projects documents onto actual situations. So, for instance, in this work, it's a video, but I'm just showing you a still. I don't have time to show you a clip from it. Some of you may know it. It's called Hostage, the Bachar tapes from 2001. And what Rad does is that he reads the memoirs of 5 Western hostages in Lebanon, and they all mention this Lebanese man who goes faceless and doesn't have a story. And so Rad invents him. He existed on one level, but he wasn't populated with detail. And so this videotape is dedicated to Rad's projection or imagination of this historical character who's missing. It's what he calls an hysterical image, which he defines as follows. We have always urged our audience to treat our documents, here he's speaking in the we of the Atlas Group. We have always urged our audience to treat our documents as hysterical documents, in the sense that they are not based on any one person's actual memories, but on the fantasies erected from the material of collective memories. In other words, this is a personification of a collective image. In fact, it's played by an actor, which for Lebanese audiences would have been highly recognizable. Okay, so there's the abstraction of history, the acknowledgement of history's abstraction, and the characterization of documents. Then I want to look at one other series very briefly to think about the relation between text and image, but also truth and fiction. This is also a part of the whoops. There you go. I can sing the rest of it, but probably wouldn't be good. So this is a series. Many of the documents in the Atlas Group are executed as notebooks, and this one is called Volume 38, Already Been in a Lake of Fire, 1991 to 2003. And what it does is it shows cutouts of cars that were used as bombs in Lebanon and gives an Arabic text or caption that includes the time, place, date of the explosion, the number of casualties, the perimeter of the crater made, the engine and axle numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just going to show you very quickly a few of these, just to give you a sense. This is just a sort of idea. I think maybe many of you may know this work already. to see the sort of choreographic way that these cars are assembled, but also how the caption doesn't conform to the normative position of the caption as an anchor, a discursive anchor to a picture. In fact, the caption is just as much a picture as the cars are. Okay. All I want to say about that then is that the caption that endows factuality to a picture is put, in this case, into a relationship where the two are set side by side again, where they're set into productive tension that is not resolved. So truth and image are undecidable. Okay, so by treating the Lebanese wars and the terror endemic to them as an abstraction, Rod denaturalizes terror by making it malleable, plastic, and even in a gesture that is politically and ethically inflammatory, making it aesthetic. So on some level, he is making terror inauthentic by showing it as an image, as an artifice, a work of art. But he also, interestingly, gains authenticity as an artist of Lebanese heritage living in New York because of his relation to the terror experienced in Lebanon. So on the one hand, the terror is rendered inauthentic. On the other, he as an artist, as a witness, is rendered authentic through his association with a certain kind of place. In his work, then, he does this by first making a character who is the effect of discourse. Bashar is a placeholder, a projection into an existing discourse where he didn't exist. But then he, as the artist, and this is showing him giving a lecture, one of his most frequent forms of working is actually giving a lecture as though he were an academic, and at some points he wouldn't even acknowledge himself as the author he is vis-a-vis the Atlas group. So here, he becomes a different kind of character, a character who is the interpreter of the archive. So on the one hand, there is the effect of the characterization of the archive, and on the other, there is the subject of the archive. And these kinds of character positions, subject positions, are in productive tension with one another. So I would argue that what matters here is drawing in information, is demonstrating the plasticity of categories such as modernity and tradition, terror and authenticity. In fact, Rod is working like most conceptual and post-conceptual artists. His medium is information, and the forms he's making are forms that are extremely consequential. Wars in Iraq were fought because people believed that there was such a thing as a clash of civilizations. And according to many politicians in my country, the current Islamic State is an effect of precisely these wars. Here I'm showing you Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, claiming that there were weapons of mass destruction in order to justify the war conducted by the United States in Iraq. And on the left is Samuel Huntington's influential Clash of Civilizations, which also helped to develop this precise war proposition, war policy, by drawing a line between the tradition-bound regression of Islamic fundamentalism and the progressiveness of modernity. Redrawing in the West. Redrawing the contours between tradition and modernity, or authenticity and terror, is thus not merely an academic exercise. It's an act of political abstraction, which, for better or worse, artists seem courageous enough to risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was incredible. There's lots to discuss, and I hope there's questions that we can kick off with immediately. But I would like to ask, and please forgive me if this has been asked already by a show of hands, who of you in the audience are practicing artists? Okay, so apropos to your question, and I think it's a really pertinent one, is what strategies exist for artists in the context of your lecture? And maybe we could also ask the audience to engage with that question too, and we can throw it out to you in a second. David.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, all right. It's hard for me to hear. Well, I mean, I'll reflect on some of what I found moving in the part of the show at Casco that I saw today, which was in the panel discussion earlier, the notion of private and public came up. And I personally think that, well, I'm not sure that there ever was a strong division between private and public, but certainly today there is, that line is extremely consequential in the sense that when we're charging something online, we want to believe in privacy, but when we're flaming someone, we want to believe in publicity. And the same thing, the same tool, the same, infrastructure is being used for both actions. And there is a kind of fantasy, I think, of privacy and publicity as dividing those activities. And I think that one of the things that, I like, and I'll bring up this much despised term, but in what is sometimes called post-internet practices, which many of the artists included in the exhibition might be, probably against their will, be collected under, though that's irrelevant in a way, are really showing they're transgressing the private-public fantasies in the way that I'm arguing that Walid Rod is redrawing the modern and the traditional, redrawing terror and authenticity. I think that redrawing privacy and publicity is extremely important. And in fact, that information is the medium that we live in, and overproduction of information, transparency via WikiLeaks, and then opacity on the part of many artistic projects are the sort of terms in which a contemporary politics of information can be developed. I mean, I actually think I've been very interested in recent arguments by people like Fred Moten about withdrawing from identity, and how certain forms of opacity vis-a-vis information are both a place of protection, if not privacy, and agency. And so I feel like, I'm not going to name names because I don't think that's super productive in a context like this, but I think that much of the work that I saw this afternoon is approaching these ethical and political problems of where emotion, affect, I know you're very engaged with affect in your work, how the things we are most affectively attached to are in fact public in multiple ways. They're designed by other people, they're distributed by other people, they're used by other people. I think this is super important, and I think that this generation, if I may say so, of artists that is represented in the show and that was at the Berlin Biennial, which I reviewed recently. Some overlap maybe, I'm not sure actually now that I think of it. Anyway, that this generation is attempting to think that affect of privacy and publicity through a media life. And I think that's super important. I think it's one of the most important things we're facing now.
So on that note, are there any comments and questions from the audience that you'd like to pose to David? A pregnant pause.
There's one. Did you raise your hand? I saw a hand. No? Okay. I hallucinated.
Okay, well, we have 10 minutes left, so perhaps there's some there's some other points we can take out of the work you saw at Casco, which I think I was also there this afternoon, and I must say there were moments there. What you said about affect really it resonates, but I think also by the same notion, the destruction of artwork in such a public and very mediated way is highly affective too, affective with an A. So this sense of affective mediation, and also the story of the curator, who is quite, I mean, in the BBC, the story was quite drawn out, and it was really quite a visceral story of how he was killed and how he had to point out specific artifacts in places, and he was withholding information. In fact, he was tortured for many hours before he would give up information of where very historical and precious artifacts that he'd guarded for so many decades were. So that story as well was relayed and told in very effective terms. So I think this entanglement of affect and affective mediation and artifacts and concepts of modernity and tradition, are also an interesting entanglement to consider.
I mean, one of the strategies that I'm trying to make, I hope this will edge toward an answer to your a response to your comment, is that the way we think about heritage is actually part of contemporary art. So it's not contemporary objects, but it's the contemporary set of values that art circulates under, the sort of regime of value that is art. So it seems to me that it's very interesting that these values are very strong on both sides of this divide. So the fact that the archaeologist was tortured in a very public way, which is a horrible act, is an assertion of the importance of a kind of cultural tabula rasa that one wouldn't necessarily think of as being high on the list. And the fact that refuge for objects has been such a kind of strong dynamic in the West, I think is also very interesting because it makes it clear that we, as people involved in art practices, have to take some responsibility for the fact that objects are easier to love than people are when they're refugees. And I think that's something we might want to think about too. What does it mean to make a pledge to cultural heritage, but want to close our borders to the inheritors of that heritage? I think that this, to me, it introduces the same kinds of contradictions that contemporary art markets demonstrate when, political art is being sold for, very high prices, and websites like Art Info, list the 25 most marketable conceptual artists, which they did recently. So, I think I would like to see some sort of thinking about the ethical position of the artist in a sort of more thoroughgoing way. Was there?
So, on the note of ethics, or the idea that artifacts and art and humans sometimes are interchangeable, or perhaps have value asserted, where, Are there any other thoughts on that as artists in the room? Perhaps on the exhibition as well at Casco. Okay, well, David, thank you. That was a fantastic talk.
Okay, thanks.
And if you want to have discussions, or you have questions that you'd like to ask in private, of course, we'll have a drink afterwards. So please feel free to do that. Thank you.
Okay.